in Canada, over 40% of all intellectual property is government funded. So that means it's coming from taxpayer dollars, right? If we as the public are not the direct beneficiary of the innovation that we've paid for, then something's wrong.
Welcome to She's Interesting, a podcast for women over 30 about business, money, and well-being. I'm your host, Rashel Hariri, and I am an award-winning marketer, I'm a startup advisor, and I'm a career coach. Today, I'm super excited to introduce all of my listeners to a really incredible guest. Her name is Zoey McKenzie. Zoey, thank you so much for joining us here today. Zoey is a former model turned investor. So impressive. She is a passionate advocate for health equity and climate preparedness. She was nominated for the Forbes 30 Under 30 Award in Consumer Technology in 2015 and has since been involved in ventures that aim to improve the lives of underserved communities worldwide. So incredible. She is the founding partner of Public Ventures, a $100 million impact fund. I'm going to say that again, $100 million impact fund that invests in early stage life science and clean tech startups, particularly in Canada. Public Ventures is dedicated to backing the technology leaders of the future who are tackling some of the most pressing challenges of our time, such as climate change, poverty, and health disparities. Zoey believes that innovation powered by philanthropy can be a powerful force for good, and that policy change and strategic investments can unlock trillions of dollars for social and environmental impact. You are amazing. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. I'm just going to get right into the questions.
Awesome.
So, you were born in Scarborough. So let's give a shout out to Scarborough because that's where I grew up, Scarborough. And then you moved to Brampton with your mom. You had a very active childhood. You were involved in music, the cadets, art. As I remember, you were saying you were a very active kid, and so your mom wanted to put you in all these programs to keep you busy. But I'm sure having this much experience and being out there in the community, making friends, learning so much, really helped to build the foundation for the woman that you are today. So let's talk about that a little bit. Looking back into your childhood, how do you think that's affected how you view the world today?
So I think we can maybe even take my story a little bit further back. My grandmother immigrated to Canada in the 70s from Jamaica. And at the time, she left her 8 children. My mom at the time was 9, back with their father in order to build a better life here. So she actually ended up cleaning homes in a very prolific community known as Bridle Path. So that's kind of where all the celebs live. And when my mom was about 16 years old, she had the opportunity to move to Canada to come with her mom. And the challenge at that time is that, of course, every teenager wants to go to school and be with friends and things of that nature, but they didn't have their papers at that time. So my mom actually had to follow my grandmother to these homes and clean with her. So she wasn't able to go back to school until she was in her 20s. In that community, if you've ever taken like a drive around, there's a small French school, a private French school, and the kids are dressed up in their uniforms. And I think for my mom, just like her desire to go to school and seeing all of these young kids in their uniforms really kind of lit a passion for her around French education. So she put me in French elementary school. And at the time, I think that is interesting. I was one of 3 Black kids. So it was myself, another young lady, and a very shy boy who grew up to becoming, a global superstar named
Is this
The
Drake?
Weeknd.
Oh, The Weeknd.
Yeah. I would say that, that environment and my mom's exposure to, a different type of lifestyle was really what influenced my childhood. So I was very aware of like the impacts around, policies. My grandmother and my mom got their papers when Pierre Trudeau called amnesty. These are the stories that I heard growing up. I heard stories about how, the rich and famous lived and how they raised their kids and the decisions that they made and the, stories that my mom heard in passing being in these homes. So I think that she tried to instill some of those values and, methodologies in terms of parenting into, my experience. When I was in elementary school, though, I was a very vocal young girl, very curious, and essentially that wound me up into a lot of trouble
Okay.
with my teachers.
Tell us more.
Yeah. So, I was a huge advocate. If my teacher said or did something that I thought was out of place, I would be the first one to call them on it. If I got sent to the principal's office, I was like,
I
okay,
love that.
you think you're sending me to the principal's office to get in trouble? Like, that's not happening. I'm going to get a written apology, and the teacher's going to have to make a declaration to the class about what they did and what they're going to change and all of this stuff.
I
So
love
it's like,
you. I love child version of Zoe. I think that's amazing because I was one of those kids that was kind of like quiet, right? I was like the immigrant kid that was kind of like more quiet in the class and didn't want to be super loud. So I love that you were like, hey, we're going to do things the right way and I'm not going to be scared of my teachers. I love that. Good for you.
So, from a very young age, very vocal, very passionate about fairness, right? And unfortunately, in a lot of ways, it created some challenges. And I was at the age of 7 diagnosed with ADHD. And, I think it was just kind of a thing at that point where a lot of kids were getting diagnosed with ADHD. But I was prescribed Ritalin. And that's a, very strong drug. It got to a point where I didn't want to take it. So my mom would try to hide the pills in my sandwiches and stuff. And, just me being a clever
Powder
girl.
it up for you.
Yeah, I would find them and I started like trading them with the other kids for like their Dunkaroos and chips and stuff. And they're like, okay, this kid, it's not going to work. So my mom had to get creative. She's like, okay,
Yeah.
I need to be able to find ways for my daughter to manage her behavior in these like school settings. Because I want her to stay in the French school and all the things, right? Have all the privileges. Her creative workaround was putting me in a lot of extracurricular activities, keeping me busy and engaged, overall like fulfilled to the point where, some of the little petty things that might have happened in the school environment didn't bother me so much. I think that just became what was natural for me to be involved in a lot of diverse activities around a diverse set of people. Ultimately, that carried through all the way to university. And it's funny, I actually went to Glendon. So anybody who knows kind of the community of Bridle Path, there is a university that is the bilingual campus for York. That sits right in front of the homes that my grandmother used to clean with my mom,
Wow.
right? So it's a full circle moment. And the challenge that I had once I got into university is that things that were fun and extracurricular for me at that point in my life, in my late teens and early 20s, started to take shape in terms of career paths. So, modeling in a catalog now looked like having to fly to New York or take time away from school for a casting call and things of that nature. And in addition to that, just I think the traditional school system isn't well suited for somebody like me.
For sure.
So, I think ultimately that drove me to entrepreneurship, where I was able to find myself and find, a way to be able to represent my skills in something that, it helped me to discover entrepreneurship. And in entrepreneurship, some of the challenges that I had in the school environment represented themselves as innovation, leadership. So, it was just more suited to my personality type and my interest. That's kind of my backstory and how I discovered entrepreneurship. And, ultimately, I'm very grateful for the challenges that I did experience because they shaped me into the woman that I am today.
Absolutely. And shout out to your mom and your grandma, because it seems like you've had some really great, strong female role models in your life, from your grandma leaving on her own to come here to a cold country where the winters are the harshest, and being alone and making it work. And for your mom to really push you to see the world differently than what's just been presented in front of you. I think it's so important because it shows you that just because you come from a certain family or you come from a certain lifestyle, it doesn't limit what you can do as you grow. I'm curious to know, as you've gone through this journey, what inspired you the most to focus on investing and ventures that address social and environmental challenges?
Yeah. I guess it's a bit of a winding road naturally, as with, most people's careers. But I spent the better part of my early career supporting and building programs to help entrepreneurs. So that included, House, which is the creative incubator for creatives in Toronto, led by The Weeknd.
House with an X, by the way.
Yeah, House with an X.
Now everyone can visualize it and they'll know.
Yeah, with XO, working in government for the Ministry for Seniors and Accessibility, and creating booklets where seniors would have access to information about programs that were available to them, to eventually launching my own pitch competition. So, as a former tech founder myself, fundraising and navigating the tech ecosystem when I first started was incredibly challenging. So, a lot of the main incubators and programs that existed were in their infancy when I was starting in tech. So, I think a lot of people have probably taken programs through BrainStation, which is pretty
Oh,
big
yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But when I started in BrainStation, it was literally in a small room, and they would have just these open sessions and bring people in. And I was a part of one of the first cohorts at Mars Discovery District, and we would watch YouTube videos and try and like navigate customer development and things of that nature. So it certainly wasn't anything like what we have today. And because of that, I felt like, entrepreneurs in Canada were severely disadvantaged.
Absolutely.
And even more so for women and people of color. So once the innovation ecosystem and entrepreneurial ecosystem matured, a lot of people that look like us were precluded from these programs because maybe they didn't have a background in tech or engineering or software development, or they didn't have an MVP. So I was like, okay, well, how can we get people started with the resources that they need to create their minimal viable products so that they can actually apply for these incubator programs? So that was Omni Pitch Connect. That pitch competition was kind of what really got me interested in supporting entrepreneurs. And then it eventually led to me doing syndication deals where I was investing in women-led founded companies.
Amazing.
I guess the social impact thing, maybe it's ingrained in me, but there is actually a story that aligns with kind of that path. if
Okay,
you
let's
will.
talk about it.
6 or 7 years ago, I was invited by the leadership team at the CAMH Foundation, so the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, to support them in developing new programs and frameworks for their doctors and scientists who are becoming entrepreneurs. So, just through mutual contacts, they thought that I would be somebody who could maybe like tear things up and, reimagine what could be possible and the most meaningful ways to support these budding entrepreneurs. Naturally, I met a ton of incredibly talented doctors and scientists. And one of them had actually developed a vitamin supplement that would minimize the symptoms for postpartum blues, which is the step before postpartum depression.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And, in my early 20s, obviously very enamored by the science. But it wasn't until about a year or a year and a half after meeting this gentleman that a good girlfriend of mine was like the first in our friend group to have a baby. And unfortunately, she suffered from severe postpartum and was separated from her newborn for several weeks in order to get treatment. And I was sitting with her at the hospital, and I'm like, the baby's coming to visit her in the hospital because she can have the baby with her there
Wow.
and everything. And I was like, there's a vitamin supplement sitting in a lab downtown. What are we doing? And that was just kind of a light bulb moment for me, because in Canada, over 40% of all intellectual property is government funded. So that means it's coming from taxpayer dollars, right?
Yeah.
And if we as the public are not the direct beneficiary of the innovation that we've paid for, then something's wrong. So it was kind of like a huge, I guess, mission for me to fight for. So I started, having deeper conversations with the tech transfer office at CAMH, and discovered that, the funding naturally was one of the biggest barriers to getting some of this innovation from basic science and discovery science into the translational phase, and then ultimately into the commercialization phase where, products are being ready for market.
There's probably so much innovation, so many products that I'm thinking more in the health related space that could be beneficial for citizens, but they're just kind of in a vault right now, or they're in a holding place. Is that accurate to
Yeah,
say
I think
that
that's like a good way to think of it, right?
Yeah.
Like they're on a shelf somewhere.
That's off? Why? Why?
Why? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I thought, right? And for life science, climate, agritech, some of these more progressive areas, First of all, they're very capital intensive, so it requires a lot of financial contribution to get them started. Because they're held to a more stringent regulatory environment, they're riskier, right? So I think that there is, certainly a lot of government grants and government funding that supports the early inception of these ideas. And philanthropists do such a wonderful job of making sure that the funding goes to the institutions that support these innovators. However, once you go through and you do a scientific discovery and you come up with an amazing idea that could turn into a product or a service, most venture funds, are kind of precluded from investing that early because you're risking the investment capital, right? So that's what creates the valley of death, and like the early stage scientific research spinoffs usually don't have access to that capital to help bridge over that valley of death.
If you were to put a percentage against the number of innovations that are created versus how many make it to market, what would that percentage be? And then also, if these ideas are sitting on a shelf somewhere, how long on average do they sit on this shelf before they make it to market?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a huge scale, right? Things are changing now, especially in the North American environment, where hospitals and universities are starting to build internal funds. So this helps to attract more traditional venture capital, but it's still not enough, right? So there are certainly some improvements. I think that there's a number of policy changes that can be made to help bridge that gap, which is kind of what got me started in this to begin with. I drafted a policy initiative called the excess benefit
I
exemption.
love you.
Yeah.
I don't want to cut you off, but
No worries.
I love that when you see a problem, you immediately have done the research and then you action it and you do something about it, but not just in a way where you're like, well, I'm creating my fund and that's going to be my approach.
Mhm.
You've literally gone to government and you're essentially lobbying for these changes as well, which I think is really fascinating because oftentimes being in the tech space and the people that I speak to, it's very focused on individualistic developments and growth within technology or within a capitalistic environment. And what you're doing is so much more impactful on a human level.
I mean, it's clear when I look back on it, but at the time it wasn't so clear,
Yeah.
right? I was just like, okay, this, terrible thing happened to my friend. It's happening to millions of people, not only in Canada, but across the world. And what can be done? At the time, I had my entrepreneurial endeavors, but, just being, I would say, somebody that is marginalized, I had a really rough start in terms of tech. So I was getting nominated for things like Forbes, but not accepted into local incubator programs.
That's frustrating.
Right? So,
Yeah.
I think for me, I also was working full time while managing my startup, right? And that working, I started off answering the phones in government. Because I speak French. So I was like, okay, able to leverage my skills.
For
and,
sure.
That led to me eventually becoming a policy advisor at the Ministry for Seniors and Accessibility. So when I was brought to the table at CAMH, I was like, okay, well, how can I actually help? What skills do I have to leverage? Because I worked in government, I had an understanding of government processes and how policy change could be put forward. So I just drafted literally a 5-page policy initiative, circulated that within, kind of my community. And it just kind of took on a little bit of a viral nature, if you will, from a policy standpoint. So being able to engage with governments at the Ministry of Finance, and then later having the opportunity to present my policy work on a global stage at the United Nations Science Summit was really,
This is amazing.
the
Okay.
trajectory for me, right?
Yeah.
And once I had the opportunity to present my work at the United Nations, and it was also validated by people in the financial sector, whether it be VCs or senior leadership at BlackRock, which is a huge financial institution. Then that's kind of when other women in senior leadership positions within the finance sector started to sow the seeds and said, Zoe, I love everything that you're doing with the policy initiative. I think it's so meaningful. But have you ever considered venture capital as a vehicle? And I was like, maybe that's something worth noting. So I kind of like pushed it to the back of my head. Maybe in like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, I'll do that. But, I think as life would have it, all of the pieces and the resources really just kind of came together. Kind of started off kind of in the mental health category. My policy initiative gave way to health equity, climate equity, and applying these to maximizing early investments from government and philanthropists in terms of supporting innovation. And, just kind of bundled that into a fund to be able to accelerate the pace of change that I think is needed to address global issues like climate change.
Going to therapy was one of the best decisions I ever made. It helped me understand myself better, and I am where I am today thanks to therapy. That's why I'm thrilled Shift Collab is making therapy more accessible with virtual therapy sessions from coast to coast and access to over 125 social workers and psychotherapists who are ready to help you navigate life's challenges. Shift Collab modernizes the therapy experience and makes it human. They're not just an app or an Uber-like therapy network. They have rigorous quality control, and their mission is to provide valuable, actionable therapy. Shift Collab is amazing. They want to make sure your therapist is the right fit for you, so they offer a complimentary meet and greet. Once you've selected a therapist you vibe with, together you decide on your goals and meeting frequency. If you need someone to talk to, visit shiftcollab.com. That's shiftcollab.com. Great therapy, better humans.
How do you go about starting a fund?
So raising a fund is a challenging endeavor for sure, especially right now. It's unprecedented, economic times. But for anybody who's really interested in getting into this, I think that it's meaningful to start to build a track record in the financial sector. I think that no matter how great you are in other areas, you're still a newbie when it comes to finance for the most part.
And I think that's fair because people need to trust you with the money.
Yes, of
Yes.
course. And a little hack, and I think that was what was really helpful for me to make that transition was instead of angel investing, I opted to do investment syndicates. So these are like mini funds. These are deal by deal investments where you're putting your own capital along with capital of other people. So based off of this, you start to understand the legal requirements, the regulatory environment, dealing with limited partners, dealing with your founders and how do you support them, and getting, I would say, like a real granular visibility in terms of how these deals are done. And then you also have the opportunity to start to network with other co-investors. So typically for me, I know that the first year that I started actively investing, I did about $500,000 in deals. Some of the contributions that I was making was actually higher than some of the investment funds. So, I think that this put me in a position where, on the cap table, I was almost like similar or akin to some of the leads. So it allowed me to more actively participate in some of the startup's journey and develop relationships with other fund managers. So that kind of set the path for me to be able to ask questions and for people to actually take me seriously, I think. I think ultimately, if you're looking to actually start a fund, there are several components that you have to think about. So it's like, okay, well, what are you investing in ultimately? Like, what's your, I guess, investment thesis, or what are you trying to support? How much capital is needed to actually make meaningful investments? And then from there, who are you going to be accepting investments from, right? So a fund is a vehicle or like a pool of capital, right? So who's putting money into your pool for you to actually make those distributions into other startups? And based on these factors, that is really what's going to set the trajectory to how you organize and set your fund up. I think it's also worth noting that setting a fund up is quite expensive. So you need to be
Have capital yourself?
Yes,
For sure.
significantly capitalized in
Yeah.
order to do so. Legal documents, can range, I would say, anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 in order for you to get your fund started, right? I think that ultimately you want to make a decision. Funds usually have a lifespan of about 10 years, right? So it's like getting into a marriage. All of the decisions that you're making are with the long view.
Are there any resources that you recommend for Canadians, Americans in North America that they can look into? And I know it's a little bit different country by country. We're not all one nation. contrary to what some people believe. What would you recommend? Where's a good place to start?
So CVCA recently launched a program where they're supporting women who want to get into fund management.
And we'll link for everyone who's listening and panicking and trying to write this down.
Yeah.
We're going to link everything to the episode in the show notes. So you can just relax and you can click on them after this episode.
Yeah, and I'll probably share some additional gems with you.
Yeah.
Venture University is a program that basically teaches people. It's like an apprenticeship program where you learn how to do due diligence and you're actively investing your own capital and capital from their fund. VC Lab is another one. So that's connected to Founders Institute, and they support people who are emerging fund managers as well. And then I feel like understanding probably funds at a high level would be Fund Launch. So that's an organization that I had the pleasure of working with for the past almost 2 years. And essentially they provide information in terms of like, how do you go about building and launching a fund? And information is available on YouTube. And they also have a more dedicated program for people who need more intensive support and coaching.
That's fantastic. These are so many incredible resources. Thank you for sharing that. What is your investment thesis? If you were to summarize it so that people understand what you're looking for, because there could be founders right now that are listening to this podcast and thinking, could this be someone that I should pitch and approach? So what's your POV?
Public Ventures, of course, is a $100 million fund, and we're focused on investing in early stage life science and climate technologies. We're particularly interested in things that sit at the intersection of climate and health. So we're positioned to do deals pre-seed through Series A with check sizes ranging from $100,000 to about $2 million. And we've actually reserved a portion of our fund for follow-on investments. So we want to be long-term partners with our founders, essentially. When it comes to climate, some people are still kind of stuck in the mindset where they just automatically think about the weather. But climate and health at this point are inextricably linked. Women and people of color actually are disproportionately disadvantaged based on climate impacts. So not only do we have extreme weather, but this can lead to more severe challenges around food security and health systems. And these are things that where women and people of color are already historically kind of, marginalized and blocked out from opportunities to leverage technology to make sure that, healthcare and health resources are made more accessible. So some of the things that we're looking for more specifically are, technologies around digital health. There's also something to be said about precision med and making sure that we're able to properly diagnose and treat these marginalized communities in a way that is effective. Advanced materials and bio-inspired materials, categories within agritech, kind of around, food security. So ultimately, we're looking for projects that are, sound in science, backed by strong intellectual property. And we've developed a network of support with tech transfer offices across Canada and the US. So most of the founders that we're looking at traditionally have a background in some way, shape, or form that is more scientific in nature. So they're doctors, scientists, engineers.
Is that a requirement? Or?
It is not. It's not a requirement, but because of the experience that I had with CAMH and understanding the lack of funding at the early stage for those types of innovation, we really tried to prioritize making sure that the public dollars, were leveraged.
That's fantastic, because I immediately think of a few founders that I know who they don't have the scientific background or the engineering background, but they have the lived experience. And so because they were facing specific health issues that went undiagnosed for years and that really impacted their quality of life, they now have created products that support, a cleaner air quality inside of homes for people who have really bad allergies to dust mites and things like that. And so I think it's good for anyone who's listening to know that if you are in that space, that's fantastic. If you have the lived experience and have a product that is vetted and works and is scientifically backed, has the intellectual property, then approach Zoe. Otherwise,
Yeah. And you know
otherwise
what?
hold off.
I think what I also want to emphasize as well is for people with lived experience, what sets us apart from other VC funds is really in terms of our investment policy. We are in the business of trying to be collaborative funders, right? So I think oftentimes there's a bit of a checklist and, VCs will do their due diligence and they're like, oh, okay, well, you're missing X, Y, and Z. So unfortunately, we can't fund you. What we try to do differently in the way that we're pioneering impact investment is really through building out strategies that provide capacity building to support, underrepresented founders. So if you have lived experience, we have access to intellectual property and potentially non-dilutive capital that's coming from, our network of philanthropists. There might be ways to marry the two and then create a really robust startup that can scale and is also scientifically backed, right? So I think that just because you don't come from a certain background or didn't have access to certain things, or maybe you're a scientist and, and maybe don't have the time to think about something from a business context, but you understand the science really well, that doesn't mean that, innovation and transformative and impactful projects should stop where they are, right? We really want to carry them forward and then kind of pull them out of either the lab or the communities into places where they can be investable from the more traditional financial market.
What advice do you have on the flip side for these entrepreneurs and founders who may be going through difficult times, who are trying to raise, who know they have a great idea, they just need the supports for it? What would you tell them in terms of their pitch process, or how can they better prepare themselves to have these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it ultimately depends on who are you having the conversations with, right? Trying to find ways to identify the most appropriate people who are going to give you concrete feedback, right? And then also, I think it's important for founders to educate themselves in terms of what's happening across the table. So what are investors really looking for? And that's going to help you decipher how best to position yourself so that they can either say yes or no, or give you the kind of feedback that you need to make changes either to your messaging, product, or understand how best to develop your business. Sometimes things are just not fair, right? And ultimately you need to build a really good support system. And if you don't have, let's say, all of the friends and family that are rooting for you, just create a brag book. I
like
literally,
that.
yeah,
Okay.
I literally had that, during my startup journey. I dealt with a lot of challenging times where I was like, why can't I just be normal? Why can't I just go to school, get a good job? Why am I so hooked on this entrepreneurial dream? And I have so much self-belief that I can do something amazing and change the world and whatever. It was very taxing emotionally, mentally. There were little wins along the way. When I look back on my journey, whether it was being able to wake up and have a good day or go to the gym, or, somebody complimented me in terms of what I was doing, or, made certain remarks, I would write them down or screenshot things. And when I was having a bad day, I would go back and I would listen or read or, just take a look at some of the archives. And that was what gave me the fuel to keep going. And without it, I'm not entirely sure that I would be here to be able to, exercise what I believe is, part of my divine plan, right? Or the divine plan that was made for me, right? So there's something about persistence. Even if you look at history, there's women who are being awarded Nobel Peace Prize awards now. And, they were on the chopping block, their bosses wanted to fire them because they were, you know what I mean? Following the
They didn't
rules
fit the
or
mold,
whatever.
yeah.
Ultimately, the world is changing, not fast enough. But the more that we're aware of these things, the more that we build community and also share our stories, is the more that the right people will find you. And then hopefully, work that we're doing with public ventures and the types of founders that we're able to support provide an example of how we should be thinking about, I would say funding as a whole. It's not it shouldn't just be impact investing. It's like, okay, there's a responsibility that you have to the greater public as somebody who is a holder and a distributor of capital. Are you making the right decisions to support the greater good of humanity? So that's kind of my thought process, and hopefully people will kind of join the train.
You mentioned something that made my brain light up when you were talking about divine plan. Are you a spiritual person, and how does that impact you on a business level?
Yeah, I certainly am. I didn't realize it. I think my first introduction to anything maybe more spiritual, like, yes, I grew up in, the church and things of that nature, but was with pageants. And I was prepping for Miss Universe Canada. And I remember my mom sitting me down and we were like doing mock interviews. And she was like, you know what, Zoe, go and read your astrology, right? Look up your birthday and like you'll find ways to be able to articulate who you are when they ask you like, okay, Zoe, so who are you? Tell me about yourself. And I was like, okay, like, looking into things. And I think
What is your sign?
So I'm actually right on the cusp. I'm born on the longest day of the year, June 21st.
Okay.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, being able to have these reference points, whether it's astrology or, I have like the pattern and like different apps like that,
Yeah.
kind of give you some visibility in terms of how to contextualize who you are and your temperament and things. But it's nice to have, a sounding board. So what resonates with me? Does this sound like who I am? Am I able to also like see myself in the way that other people see me? So there's also something called like the Johari's window.
Oh, I don't know about
Johari's
that.
square. So it's like you do a little matrix and like one part is like things that you know about yourself that other people don't know. And then things that you know about yourself that other people know. Things that you don't know about yourself that other people know, and then things that like
I need to do this.
yeah,
This
it's
sounds
like a
amazing.
whole exercise. You give it to like your friends and
Yeah.
family, and then you look back and you're like, oh my goodness, like this is really interesting in terms of like characteristics that people see in me that I didn't see in myself, or that I see in myself, but other people don't see in me, right? And then having that as a baseline helps you to understand your path or to accept your path, because sometimes it's not all bright and rosy.
Ding, ding, right there. Yeah.
And you know what's so funny? Last night I was up and I was looking, this is the first time I've ever heard of it, but it's called cardology. And basically it's like, just a traditional deck of cards, and there's a certain card, like it can be like the 6 of diamonds or the ace of spades or whatever that's associated with a birthday. And my birthday is associated with the 9 of clubs. So apparently the name for this card is universal knowledge. And I was like,
You're like, you don't say.
right?
Yeah.
And basically 9s are like your like final soul path. So like this is, kind of like the Olympics, if you will, or the of like ascension. And it's about using the knowledge that you've acquired and sharing it with the world. And I was like, that makes so much sense why I had so much conflict growing up in terms of like finding my path and understanding like where do I navigate, what's the community or the industry for me, and finding ways to be able to float and navigate through all of them and collecting little bits of information and then putting them together in a unique way that really resonates from a human-centered standpoint. So now, like when I look back, I was like, okay, it all makes sense. And maybe things will fall apart again and I'll have to rebuild myself and understand, kind of where my path should be taking me. But it's always nice to have those types of tools as a reference point.
I often find when you can't be looking in the mirror and recognizing who you are, that's where a lot of the challenges come. And I find, especially in the tech space or people that aren't as spiritual, there's a lot of ego that takes over because you're not willing to recognize your faults and what you're good at and what you're not. And then that could lead you into the wrong path when it comes to your career and how you want to show up in the world.
Yeah, certainly. And I think just to add to that point, there's something to be said about time, right? And letting life play out, because you need those experiences to be able to reflect on and then understand who you are or who you were in those moments and how they have shifted you in one direction or another, and just accepting that certain things are just what they are. And now it's up to you to determine how you want to deal with that, right? Or show up in the world, as you said. So, yeah, I think that there is something really powerful about being, tapped into your spirituality and who you are, and also finding time to connect with things and people around you. For me, as somebody who I still think of myself as pretty new to the climate space, understanding how we're all connected just makes it more important for me and the work that I'm doing and how I show up in the world and the lifestyle changes that I'm making. I think that it also helps me to appreciate other people for who they are and, their role in our universe, right? So,
I love that. It sounds like a lot of this is just coming from acceptance and understanding. I think the more that you accept your path, you understand yourself, you accept the people around you for what their path is and what they can contribute, the happier you are. And I feel like this is like a Brene Brown portion of this podcast, but this is where I love the conversations going, because we started off very technical and talking about, like VC land and what that looks like and how to get involved in $100 million fund. And now we're ending the episode on, I think, like a very high note, because we're talking about the individual and your individual journey and how you've grown and you've developed. And really a lot of that is what brought you to where you are today. If you weren't a reflective person, if you weren't willing to face your challenges or to recognize and learn from your past experiences, there's no way you would be where you are today. It's because you're so perceptive and you're recognizing that you're walking through the world and you're learning every day. I think that's what makes you really great at what you do as well. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. This is my last question. Before we go, what productivity hacks do you have for any of the women listening in our 30s, may have kids, may not have kids, may be married, may be single, may be partnered up? How can we be more effective and productive with our time?
I love a good hack, but it's just like, why do we have to focus on productivity and doing more? I think that the real hack to bring your best self and present your best work is really by making sure that you live a meaningful and intentional day-to-day experience. So for me, I would say that I guess the hack that I used, it's funny, I was in therapy after a pretty bad breakup. But my therapist, she asked me, she's like, you seem to just talk about work a lot and, being a new mom, but like, who are you outside of being a mom and who are you outside of work? And I couldn't answer. I was like, I can't think of anything.
Okay.
Right. That led me to like sitting and reflecting. I'm like, okay, who is Zoey? What makes her feel fulfilled? Right. And I was like, okay, Zoey will be, a philanthropist and spend her time helping other people and building community initiatives. And she goes to Pilates and plays tennis and all of this stuff. And those became my rocks. So I don't know if you've ever heard of like there is a theory that if you have rocks, pebbles, and sand, the way that you put them into the jar will determine like how much can fit.
That's right. Yeah.
So it was up to me to determine what rocks were important and placing those in there. So, I was like, okay, tennis and physical activity and things like that is important to me. But I didn't realize at the time that I needed more fun in my life. Like I suck at tennis, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, making time for myself really helped me to be a better person and to also set better boundaries ultimately. So instead
and to play.
Yeah. I think it was just like the productivity hack is really, if you want to do more, you have to make more time for you, because then everything else will naturally align itself to be able to support your best you. I guess it's a convoluted way of looking at things. But yeah, that was the main thing for me, is, just being able to set those priorities. And that helped me to be better at saying no and setting boundaries and organizing my time in a way that, helped me to bring my full self to my everyday life in whatever capacity.
That's perfect. I think that it's, you have to put yourself first. You have to make space so that you can feel refreshed and do the things that you love that bring you joy outside of work. Not to say that work doesn't bring us joy. It absolutely does. but that's not all there is to experience in life. And so I think adding that element of play is really important, especially as women, as we get older, that it's like we're not supposed to have fun anymore. And we're supposed to take on all these burdens and do all this work and be so serious. And I love laughing. I love being silly. I like doing activities. I like crafting with my niece. Like there's so many things that can make us feel fulfilled and feel good outside of work. And so I love that that was your answer. And it's like, to be more productive, you need to be more whole so that you can focus on these things. So with that being said, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This was such a beautiful conversation. I really enjoyed chatting with you today. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, I will have your LinkedIn in the show notes so people can find you. And as always, thank you to our listeners for tuning in to She's Interesting, for subscribing, for downloading the episodes. Please make sure to rate and review the podcast. It really helps us out. And don't forget to check us out at she'sinteresting.com, where you can sign up for our newsletter. Follow us on Instagram. We'll have some behind the scenes footage of Zoe and I chatting. And again, thank you so much for being on the show.